From the valleys of Tennessee and breaking through the barriers of perceived reality, you have now crossed over to the far side. And on today's edition, we are joined by a gentleman by the name of Gerald Clark. And I've invited Gerald to give us a more in-depth view of the Anunnaki. Several months ago, as many of you are aware, I had on Andy Lloyd, and Andy was discussing Planet X, the dark star theory, but he didn't really get into the Anunnaki much. And quite honestly, while I've heard some things about the Anunnaki, I've not done much research on it. So in a lot of ways, you can consider this to be Anunnaki 101. But before I do get to Gerald, I do want to say a hello to everyone at BeyondDarkMatter.com, especially to the new members that have recently joined. And I also want to say hello to everyone at our Facebook page, facebook.com/paranormalpodcast, as well as to everyone who has subscribed through TuneIn Radio, Stitcher Radio, as well as our YouTube page. Every interview that I do for The Far Side, I always put it up on the YouTube page. And one more item before we get to Gerald Clark. As I mentioned before, there are multiple venues in order for you to subscribe to the Far Side podcast. And most of what I know have been for the iOS devices because that's what I know. It's what I use. And I asked for you to just give me some information on what you're using for Android devices. The two biggest names seems to be Beyond Pod and Podkicker. And I do want to thank everyone for sending in your suggestions on what you use, what you like, what you don't like. And with that said, Gerald, welcome to the Far Side.
Thanks, Bob. It's nice to be here, and a warm welcome to you and all your listeners.
Well, it's great to have you here with us. The Anunnaki and Nibiru has been one of those topics that's been filled with controversy after controversy from NASA, scientists, and even just the regular individuals. Would you mind giving us a brief overview of what actual evidence there is supporting the existence of the Anunnaki and their home planet?
I'm not sure where your listeners exactly are on this. I know that you've done one interview and discussed the Anunnaki, so I'm going to tell my version of the story. And if I get too much into detail, push me along, okay? Because we have a lot to talk. We have a lot to talk about. So what do we know? Number one, as an engineer, when I started looking at this story, the idea of a directed graph or a genealogy table just kept smacking me in the face because there were so many names reading through the Sumerian documents. And that's where we started, is with the Sumerian tablets. I told the story multiple times how I ended up stumbling on what I believe were the first writings. It turns out there were probably other first writings. These ones just so happens because of the warring factions that were going on in Mesopotamia. Some of the temples along the Tigris and the Euphrates were torched, and one of them was Sippar. And inside Sippar, they found a whole set of chronological tablets that had been essentially fired that lasted better than many of them. And so we ended up with massive amounts of cuneiform tablets out of the Tigris and the Euphrates. And this really reached its apex about 110 years ago. And then for a long time, nobody could read them, the typical issue with a new language. And then finally, after linguists tore them apart, and non-linguists too, I give you George Smith out of the University of London, or the Museum of London. The British Museum, he actually was not trained as a linguist and read the first Atrahasis account and determined there was a flood story there. And so he's an interesting guy. Anyway, so we have all this data. Many sources now have published the Sumerian records. You can go online on the internet and look at it. And there's a database through Oxford University that you can go in and log into. And so through this process of digitizing the tablets, getting that information out there, all of a sudden in the last 20 years, all of a sudden people have access to information that they haven't seen in thousands of years. That's been buried in the sands of the temples all along Mesopotamia. So this process of getting the information out there has taken some time. So now so given that, what do we know? As an engineer, I started putting together my genealogy table and my chronology chart from the best that I could understand. And the person that seemed to be the lead in doing that research, according to my left engineering brain, was Zecharia Sitchin. He gave you all the data, as much as he could get, gave you the references and said, this is just what it says. Go look at it yourself. And, did he make some mistakes? Probably. Were they enough to discredit his theory? Absolutely not. So, starting 450,000 years ago, on a planet that's at a 3,600 retrograde orbit around our sun, they called it Nibiru. Harrington called it Planet X, and the 10th planet. So X in Roman numerals means 10. It also kind of signifies unknown as a variable in science and computers. When you write equations and such, you oftentimes use X as a variable. So it was an unknown. But at the same time, that what we do know as of 86 or so, when that interview was done between Dr. Harrington and Zecharia Sitchin on video, it's on my website, GeraldClark77.com. You can go look at the video yourself under the Anunnaki playlist. A seminal video that put a stake in the ground, said, here's Planet X, here's where we think it's going to come through, and so on and so forth. So that was very interesting information, because the documents from the Sumerians stated that they had problems on their planet, specifically atmospheric problems, because according to their creation account, their solar system did not originally, or their galaxy did not originally support the orbit that they were in. They actually got caught into the orbit of our galaxy, according to their creation account, which caused the perturbations of Neptune and Uranus that had Harrington and others looking out at the edge of the solar system at these planets to figure out, why are they not aligned with the solar ecliptic? Why are they at such a crazy tilt? So this caused them to start looking out there anyway. So according to them, when their planet came into close perihelion with our sun in this retrograde orbit, being so far out away from the sun, that they were suffering atmospheric damages to their various layers in their atmosphere that they seem to indicate were generated geothermally. Yes, if you're out 3,600 years in a 3,600-year orbit past Pluto, you're not going to get radiation from the sun significantly to warm your planet. It's got to come from somewhere else. Mm-hmm. There's lots of planets that are radiating energy that aren't close to the sun, but they have molten cores, and the heat is generated internally. So their problem was to trap the gases to create their atmosphere. Now, in their account, Alalu was the ruler at the time. He apparently was this 450,000 years ago. He was the one looking at the volcanoes at the same time that another peer of his from Nibiru named Lamu was looking at it. So apparently they were looking at the volcanoes, the atmosphere. Could we naturally aggregate the volcanoes to cause a dispersion of gas to create an artificial layer of the atmosphere? That was something they were considering. Simultaneously, they were considering, actually, they were going to perturb it violently with nuclear weapons, shooting nuclear weapons into their volcanoes. The second thing they considered was, potentially putting a transition metal in the atmosphere, and that's where the idea of monoatomic or ionized gold came up. So at that point, Alalu was an unjust ruler. He had usurped the throne. He was challenged by Anu, who served him as a cupbearer for a long time. Anu was the next person in line to rule. They fought. Anu won the battle and basically had him incarcerated. He was ready to be judged for his usurpation. And about that time, this being Alalu stole a craft, left for the Earth, and essentially had devised a kind of a scheme, it seems in retrospect, to find a solution to their atmospheric problem and then use it as leverage and politically to get back in good with the beings on Nibiru. So about that time, apparently he found gold around the Persian Gulf area. Anu, now the king on Nibiru, had two children. One of them was Enki, the other one was Enlil. And he had other kids too, but I'm going to focus on those two for now. Enki was a premier scientist. He was Anu's firstborn son. He was sent to the Earth about 445,000 years ago to meet with Olalu, verify the gold was there, and then determine whether it was there in sufficient quantities, I'm sure, as a scientist, such that they could ionize it in their atmosphere and protect themselves when they came into close perihelion with the sun. Look at the radiation problems we're having right now with the sun and its maximal solar cycle. It's a very similar problem that we're having.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So about that time, Enki lands in the Persian Gulf. He builds the first city on this planet that we know of. The name of it is Eridu. It's right where the Tigris and Euphrates meet and dump into the Persian Gulf. You can go on Google Earth and see it today. It's quite interesting. We really don't know that much about it. I don't know that it's been excavated extensively. And you have to ask yourselves, if we know that's the first city on this planet, why has not been the total focus of archaeologists? Let's think about that, yeah. So given that, they tried to get gold, apparently from the oceans, and there is colloidal gold in the oceans. It's just very difficult to extract. They weren't getting it fast enough. Enki was directed by his father, Anu, to go to Africa. I'm sure they were using spectroscopy and over-the-horizon radar and every other kind of advanced technology that they had. They were way more advanced than we were. They located the gold, and about that time, we pick up in a document that's very seminal called the Atrahasis. Atrahasis, Atrahasis. And in this document, it describes these beings that came with Enki. We call them the Ajiji. Apparently, there were about 50 of them initially. He took them to Africa to mine gold, not colloidally, but it looks like they were actually digging and mining, piling up dirt. So in the Atrahasis, it opens talking about how the gods were doing all the work and the mining, clearing the Tigris and Euphrates, and doing all the building, and then eventually they mutinied. They got very upset after being here for a very long time. Now, something that people don't consider. Excuse me a second. I'm gonna have a little drink. They don't consider the difference in the gravity on the planet, our planet here, versus where these people probably came from. Unless the planets had the exact same gravity, there were differences they were dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so over 3,600 years, one Shar, they apparently worked many Shars according to the Atrahasis account, multiple accounts of 3,600 years. Now, this isn't something I normally do, but I'm going to do it to tie some numbers together real quick. In the Sumerian kings list, the first 9 kings ruled for 241,000 years, ending with Noah's flood. Now we've got a timetable if the Sumerians are telling us the truth. If they landed in the mines 450,000 years, worked for approximately 240,000 years, many Shars if you count them, 28,800 years is 8 Shars. And that's the duration the first ruler ruled as a king in the city of Eridu that Enki built. And you can see that in the Sumerian kings list. Okay, so where were we? We were back in Africa. Enki's trying to get gold. At this point in the Atrahasis, Anu, Enlil, and Enki show up in this account, and they cast lots to divide regions. And we didn't really know why they were doing this, but you find out later that Enki and Enlil did not get along at all. Okay, so Anu was there. He was their father, and he basically divided into 4 regions. Gave Enki Africa. Enlil got Mesopotamia, including Eridu, that was now up in the region where Enki first built his city. So he effectively, and then he partitioned the Sinai Peninsula for the Anunnaki only, and he gave the Indus Valley to his favorite granddaughter, Inanna. So at that point, there's these Ajiji miners who've been there many Shars mining. They mutiny, surround Enlil's house in the Atrahasis account, and they demand relief. And they're armed. They burned all their tools. They say, we've had enough. And at this point, we discover that there's a concept of an Anunnaki council that's ruling these beings, and some of them show up in this account and discuss what to do about these mutinying miners. Okay, so we start to, and at this point, I really cued in and started paying attention to the personification of these beings to try to glean what their attributes were so that you could identify their deeds, if you will. Mm-hmm. You know, looking at the spirit of the being, if you will. And right out of the gate, the commander, which is interesting to me, I don't understand why Enlil is down in Africa, but he is. And by the way, that's where they were. They were mining gold in Africa, and we have thousands of mines, hundreds of thousands of gold mines all over in Africa. And it turns out it happens to be in the same area that the Sumerians said. So this is Michael Tellinger's work. Okay. So at this point, the Anunnaki say, well, they've been overworked. We've been hearing the noise. We knew there was a problem, and we didn't do anything about it. And at this point, they send out their liaison, Nusku, to go find out what's the problem with this rabble rousing. What do you guys want? What are your terms? We're seeing this all over the world right now, right? So what are your terms? And they come back, we want relief. We want a replacement. We don't want to do this anymore. And we've been overworked. And Anu looks at him and goes, yeah, I guess you have been overworked. Well, this is right after Enlil steps up as the commander. Think of him as a bureaucratic commander. Okay, he steps up and says, "Nah, let's kill one and get him back to work." Yeah, that's just So all of a sudden, you're starting to see what kind of a brutal taskmaster this is, and they're working a day and night apparently. Okay, so. And then at this point, you find out Enki and his father Anu go, "No, they've been overworked. Let's get them some relief." They outvote him. He's pissed. He puts on a fake crying routine for the whole thing. That's even in the account. I can't even believe it. And yeah. So at this point, they apparently decide as a council to create a replacement worker for these Igigi miners that have been there for a very long time. Okay. Now everybody wants to know: are the Igigi the alien greys? What are they? We don't really know. What I do know is in the Lost Book of Enoch, in the account where 200 of them grouped together and decided to take human wives for themselves. Okay, so this kind of fits in very well with the Igigi now, if you realize this. Under Azazel's, he took the lead, said, if we all group together, then we won't get in trouble. Well, their offspring were human-looking, and apparently some of them grew into Gabborim, into giants, what we call the Nephilim. Okay, but they still looked human. They weren't reptilian. They weren't, they weren't funky looking. They looked just like us. So from my understanding, the Igigi were not the alien greys, even though some very significant researchers are saying that they have links through interviews with colonels that have been in the military exposed saying they are. But okay, so that's what I know about that. At this point, Enki, being the scientist, and his half-sister, who's very key to the story, her name is Ninhartsog, and she was known as Isis in Egypt. By the way, Enki was known as Ptah, P-T-A-H, in Egypt. Okay, so all of a sudden these Sumerian gods, all of a sudden, they're the same ones that were in Egypt and Mesopotamia and Iran and Syria, and you'll start to see a pattern here because their names start showing up in these seminal documents that I focused on in my book, Atrahasis and Numa Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and all the other documents that I read from Sitchin were fantastic and painted a wonderful story, but those ones did not come from him, and they still tell the same story. So that's the reason I approached writing my book the way I did, and I venerate Zecharia Sitchin. He's my eyes. He's a dead hero. Mm. Nobody's ever perfectly right about anything.
That's right.
But he was a groundbreaking researcher who put out a theory that has lasted. It's lasted to this day and is taught in universities because it's irrefutable what he wrote. Much of it. Okay, so now we've got Enki, his half sister Ninhartsog, who turns out to be the medical officer. Very, very handy to have the medical officer when you're about to do what you're about to do. Yeah, they banty about what are we going to do to replace these miners, and they talked about tools. They talked about that. And at this point, it's like everybody goes, well, why wouldn't they're so advanced? Why wouldn't they build tools to do this advanced mining? Why would you use, slave labor? I give you Mars and our rover. What wins as remote telemetry and work agents? Meat wins over machines. Think about it. Machines break down. How would you support transporting very large mining equipment to the earth on your vessels? It's bad enough to think about processing the ore and maybe having to get it into a monoatomic form where it's very light to send it, but it's a huge logistical problem. So they bantied around machines or meat. They chose meat. And at this point, Enki divulges, and it wasn't in the Atrahasis account, this came from elsewhere, that he was a scientist. He'd been there many thousands of years. He knew about the bipedal hominids on the steppes of Africa that were very much not evolved anywhere to the point where they could communicate with them, but he was aware of them. He offered up a genetic augmentation onto the bipedal hominids that he had discovered down in Africa where the gold mines were to make them a replacement for the Igigi miners. And they went through many iterations to do that. They were essentially geneticists, okay? And at that point, they finally came up with a solution. There were many failures using animals and all kinds of things in their account. So this ought to be shocking to any scientist who's reading about genetic manipulations going on, 200,000 years ago in South Africa. Well, it did. And so one of the things I put in my book for evidence that I, as a scientist, was keen to, because I was working at the University of California, San Diego, when I was crossing paths with some of the people that were doing some of these research studies. And they'd done a genetic Eve and a genetic Adam study to essentially look at the Y chromosome deterioration and the mitochondrial DNA deterioration to find the male and female, respectively, of our Homo sapiens sapien antecedents. Well, they found that, and they believed it was in South Africa, the same area where these gold mines are, approximately 200,000 years ago. Now, all of a sudden, given this benchmark that I gave you, 241,000 years for the first Sumerian kings list, then the flood, back that up from the 450,000 years when they came here, what they said. Now you're in approximately the 200,000 year range, exactly when they said they did the genetic augmentation of either Neanderthal. I believe it was Neanderthal that existed at the point that they used. Now, they may have tried it on Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon. Who knows? They probably tried a few different ones. So why restrict yourself, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, a chimera is a chimera. So they finally found a solution. They were very excited when they in vitro fertilized the medical officer with the combination of a egg from a bipedal hominid, let's call it Neanderthal, a female, with finally, ultimately, which is surprisingly, they used Enki's semen or his sperm to mix with that egg and create the first baby. So all of a sudden, you're like, wow, you guys are talking about cloning yourself? That's pretty extreme. If you're going to create a slave species, you try to use an animal or something else that didn't have, just had enough awareness to do what you wanted it to without impinging on your levels of consciousness. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, he mixed his genetic material with this in vitro fertilized Nin Hartzog, the medical officer, and they had the first kid. And this is the story of Adam, or Adapu. They called him many different names. And they did multiple experiments with him after they created a female partner to go with him. And at this point, they couldn't procreate. And they were studying him to determine the extent to which they could follow their commands and be good slaves, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think of it from a scientific standpoint. And if you really want to think about it from a scientific standpoint, think about how you would give a being a subset of your DNA so you didn't give them all your capabilities. This is advanced genetics. So some people have looked at the human DNA in the chromosomes and looked at the second chromosome to try to understand, why is there a splicing here? There's clearly a splicing in our DNA, and supposedly a large part of it that's inactive. Well, we're just now starting to understand some of that inactive DNA, which is interesting to me. I don't know if you've read about the recent finds on the 95% supposedly junk DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Are you?
Yes.
Can I bring? Have you read about? I'll bring that in real quick. Apparently, we know that the DNA that we've been able to map or produces proteins, whereas this metadNA or that we didn't understand, this 95% junk, apparently it is involved in memory and sequencing of the other genetic material that then essentially it's like a gear mechanism that times the sequencing of the RNA and the DNA transpose and all the chemicals that have to come together in the exact timing. So that is just amazing. So now we have a lexicon and a meta control computer in our DNA that we're just now finding out about. And how much more are we going to find out?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so it just keeps going.
It was just recently, actually. I don't know if you've read this. I think it was last year or the year before, where scientists have announced that ancient humans had relations with a mystery species, and they're unable to identify this DNA.
Yeah, well, I think the wish of Zecharia Sitchin, one of his dreams was that a geneticist would get a hold of some Anunnaki DNA and sequence it and prove once and for all that our DNA is a subset of it. And this shows up in the movie Prometheus. They find this DNA and then she runs it on her little sequencer and she's all elated when they find out
Oh
that they
yeah.
finally found. Yeah. So it's the same. It's the same thing. But we have the bodies. That's the crazy part. Listen, we have the bodies and we have the technology to do it. We're just not being told.
Hmm.
So the reality is, we are chimeras of the Anunnaki and probably a bipedal hominid from the steppes of Africa, whether it's Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal. I personally think it's Neanderthal. So that being said, look at the construct of our brain. We have a three-stage brain, one of which is reptilian, and then mammalian, and then the final outer neocortex. So at stages, we were in various places in our evolutionary path when we got genetically augmented. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there are theories that Anunnaki weren't the first ones to do this. That according to Klaus Dana and others, there's been interactions on this planet for millions of years. So who knows who's done what to who? And, think about it from this standpoint. This kind of will step back a little bit. Imagine you were a galactic organization that was colonizing planets to get their resources, and others are doing it too. How would you put your stake in the ground so that when you came back, you said, nope, that's ours, it's not yours? You either stay there yourself and set up an outpost, or you put your offspring there so that they can build new settlements like in the West Bank, like that. So we are their offspring. I think there are multiple offsprings on this planet. I don't think we're all the same genetic species. And there are genetic wars going on over the control of resources on this planet, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this goes on lots of planets, not just here.
The problem resides in that if they were to put their stake here in us, we don't have any knowledge of this. Therefore, if they were to come back and said, all this is ours, we're going to retaliate, just like the original ones did, but at a more advanced level, maybe, with nuclear weapons, etc. We will fight against the Anunnakis, and we may lose.
Well, this is the interesting thing. Now you bring up something really, really tantamount to what's happening, and it's a convergence of the religious right, the Mayan calendar. Everybody's thinking there's some end time event going on right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had my theory that if you just look at the zodiacal houses, when the Anunnaki Council would change, they would change composition, and whoever ended up in the rank 50, which is Lord of the Earth rank. That's why 50 is a pretty important number to Enlil. He was the Lord of the Earth, rank 50. Marduk took it away from him circa 2000 BC and had the 50 names of Marduk read to him because he was ranked 50 at that point, circa 2000 BC in Babylon. I digress. Let's see, what were we going after here? So there's this concept of the Anunnaki coming back, and that all the movies have portrayed the returning gods as, it's either cataclysmic or Independence Day. They're coming back to destroy us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what if they were coming back to make this a permanent outpost? Some of them were already here and had been part of the advance team that came back way back when, to mine gold, set up infrastructure. They built all the most amazing stone temples all across this planet, including pyramids and everything else. That should be no surprise to anybody. What if they had set up an underground base here and decided at some point we're going to let the slaves know that we created them, that we're still here, but only after they've done all the things that we want for them to set up our infrastructure for us, build all our underground bases so that we can survive any radiation events from the sun, make sure that we have food production all lined up for us, basically have the slave task force to completely establish the infrastructure for them to exist here. Now, before they didn't have that, and they, when they first showed up, tried to get gold, they didn't have that, but they had us now. And so imagine that occurred, and that their symbols have been here on this planet representing various governments from the word go. Mm-hmm. If you just look, you'll see it. As a matter of fact, I found something really, really interesting. It kind of brings, before I lose track of the alien savior thing, let me finish that, and I want to bring you to something else. So there's theories that the Catholic Church has set up a Lucifer scope on Mount Graham in Arizona. They're looking for this coming Luciferian being that they're venerating. Well, who is that? The Illuminati are venerating the same being. Okay, so now you realize the Illuminati were aligned with the Catholic Church way back in 1776 when Weishaupt infiltrated the Masons. So they're all kind of the same. So all of a sudden you go, wait, so who is Lucifer? Well, if you just figure out the that answer, you would find out how they relate to this Anunnaki Council. Okay, so all of a sudden, these beings on the Anunnaki Council, Anu, Enki, Enlil, Ninhursag. One of the sons of Enlil is Nannar-Sin. He was the moon god, had a huge following in Mesopotamia, and he also showed up in the Atrahasis account, led the Gigi rebels to his father's house. Well, guess what? He's Allah. So now you find out that Enlil is Yahweh, Nannar-Sin is Allah, and that all the religions on the world were set up by them in order to control us. So it's like, wow. Okay, so this alien savior thing. If they were to make themselves known all of a sudden in the midst of chaos, order out of chaos, they would that their civilization could potentially rise like a phoenix out of the chaos that's happening right now. You know, that's the idea of the rising of the phoenix, right? Mm-hmm. So if these beings were all homogenous, they all wanted us here or they all wanted us dead. That then you'd see the extreme of one or the other. What if some of them want us, are benefactors like Prometheus to us, and other ones want us managed and culled like slave beings, like ants? So all of a sudden you realize that Enki and Enlil do represent that very scenario, and the Zoroastrians knew this in modern day Iran. It's Iran now, but in Zoroastrian times in Persia, they viewed the chief gods of the Anunnaki Council, the two that were here. Anu was not here, by the way, with casting the lots. He went back to Nibiru. I failed to mention that. Enki and Enlil were still here. They were the most powerful beings on that council. One of them represented creation to them. The other one represented destruction. And let's see. Let's go back to the Atrahasis account, the very first one that said, they don't need relief. Just kill one and make them go back to work. Which one do you think that one was? His spirit continued that way all the way through the accounts. He is the great destroyer. And it turns out he's actually, in the Greek pantheon, he was Zeus. Now, we'll go back and read some of the Greek. I'll give you a scene out of Jason the Argonauts. Very first scene of the movie, that one of the kings is being propped up to go overthrow a kingdom on behalf of, and he got the condolences of Zeus, supportedly, to have him go and kill and murder and do all this. Okay, first of all, no benevolent being would set you up in a situation where that would be okay. Mm-hmm. No benevolent being would ask you to take your kid to an altar to sacrifice him on their behalf. The same one has done that over and over and over again. Okay, so anyway, so the idea of this alien savior thing is very important, because what if one of them was Enlil and the other one was Enki, and they were operating simultaneously in this simulator that we're caught up in as their slaves to figure it out. Mm-hmm. You choose this one, you're going to get destroyed. You choose that one, and you're signing up for light and wisdom and potentially evolving your consciousness to the point where you wake up like they are.
Yes.
So one of them wants that, and the other one doesn't. So if you were to just boil this down to how they're characterizing their viewpoint on slavery, one of them doesn't believe in it, the other one does. But one of them participated in it, but in his memoirs, Enki I'm speaking of, wrote about his struggling with fate and destiny and what has been imposed on these humans. You know, he viewed it as, well, these bipedal hominids, they were, he recognized them because they were a life form he recognized from their planet. In the collision account, we ended up with an unintentional panspermia where much of their seeds of life from their planet landed on this one. Okay, so they recognized it, and that's probably part of why they had interest here in the first place, is they knew a history of this planet and its resources. So that's a very interesting way to think about this now, is you've got a creator and a destroyer, and they're vying for your level of consciousness, and that either you're going to choose the path to wake up and become a benevolent son of God, like John, like the Bible in the New Testament in John 1:12 and 1:14. If you read those two, and now think about them potentially throwing you a line so that you can get out of this quarantined simulation where you're a beat down slave, a primitive worker that they designed to work in the mines. It seems to me, and I was watching this really, really interesting YouTube video where William Shatner in 1977 was doing a interview of the various people talking about the ancient gods. Very interesting. Anyway, toward the end of it, he met this really wild looking scientist who had no hair but a huge beard, glasses, and the whole thing. And he was at an observatory, and he was talking to him, and this guy made a profession that I think is very interesting and very telling for this time. He said, he goes, well, blah blah blah, all these beings on all these different galaxies, and he said, if you pay attention to your consciousness and evolve it, there's a point in time, and I don't understand why, but they start communicating with you. You're on their frequency, essentially, is what he was saying. And I'm here to tell you, from all the people that are fans of mine, readers, and so on and so forth, I believe that's true. If you think about the division of the brain into various brainwave frequencies, delta, theta, alpha, and beta, that we don't truly know if you were able to be in a waking consciousness at, I don't know, 2 hertz, what that would be like. I mean, that's an out-of-body experience for people in REM sleep, okay? Down in that 4 hertz region. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden you start thinking about the dimensions and brainwave frequency. You realize, well, if I was on a different radio channel, I might see and hear and experience something very differently than what I'm getting right now.
Exactly.
And so when I looked at that, being a little bit of an engineer again, I realized that we're energy. And I was trying to understand this in order to make sense of how an advanced being would have created us using the electromagnetic spectrum, which they fully were aware of, and how they would have used it to either facilitate us waking up or keeping us enslaved. And the electromagnetic spectrum is the perfect remote vehicle or agent for doing that if you look at our electrical construct of our bodies. So in other words, what I'm saying is your quantized levels of consciousness, if you do the right things, incrementally, you might get to the place where you can have the brainwave frequency and be on their channel. And I'm dumbing this down a lot, okay? I give it a lot more credence in my book. But that seems to be true. So I've kind of become an agent of, the Anunnaki story is extremely interesting. But to me, where I'm at, it seems to me that they have set up a situation for us to either destroy ourselves or find a way out. And very few people find the way out. This is the analogy that Jesus gave about a rich man and a camel getting through the eye of a needle. It's the gate is very narrow. I don't understand that part. Listen, if you created a bunch of genetic slaves that are dumbed down, beaten down with frequency, poisoned with every kind of chemical the government makes okay, how could you expect them to get through the gate and elevate their consciousness when the people don't even have a chance genetically from the very beginning? So very few people get out of the simulator. And I give you the Truman Show. Did you see that?
Yes.
So right at the end, he finally faces his fear in his archetypal journey, gets across the storming sea, and all of a sudden he finds the end of his simulator, and he gets out. Listen, that's what the Anunnaki have set up for us, truly. So when you find... Go ahead.
Is everything a hologram like scientists are now beginning to think? Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, it is. And the idea of a hologram, if you've never worked with one physically, how they work, it sounds ridiculous, but it's actually very simple science. Speaking of that, just recently, I think it was the Turkish leader who decided to put up a 20-foot hologram of himself in front of the people where he got reelected. Is it Erdogan? I believe it was. And or look on YouTube, but people are now starting to use holograms to present themselves on stage. One of the leaders in India did it at, I think, 200 different places when he was going on his campaign for election. He decided to broadcast from one place in here and present his hologram all across. Pretty neat. And there's a couple of companies that are doing this now. I looked on YouTube. I think it was American Hologram or something like that. But it's pretty neat how they do it. And it's not. And if you didn't know that the stage was set up to support this, how would you know? What do we know about the human brain as a aggregation device of our various sensors? We've got our ears, our nose, our mouth, our sight, and our touch. And those 5 senses end up in electrical signals that get accumulated in the brain and paint a picture of what's going on in the world. Well, this is an electrical signal. Okay, now you're all of a sudden in energy and matter where a simulation can be set up, right? So now you start talking about, well, what is an object? What are the parameters of an object? What is how do you establish the field of density? Density equals mass over the area. And then all these things, and so you touch something, you think it's dense. Well, that's a feedback to your brain, of these particles that are all attached together in various structures. And we know everything's energy, and structure is kind of an illusion. So now, if you get deep into the idea of a hologram and how it can be done, there's a movie called The 13th Floor, where they're talking about how a simulator can be made and having bodies as avatars for energy and so on and so forth. And now you're starting to get into this place where you're talking about reincarnation, that a body is just a container that can hold energy. And I actually think that is the case. And it can hold energy based on the extent to which you don't control your own energy. So imagine you've got 7 little containers that can hold energy, your chakras, and you're only using the bottom one. Well, what kind of energy can sit in the 6 above it? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's not even your energy. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So the idea of them influencing us and controlling our mind state using the electromagnetic spectrum is what I'm trying to say. And there's various ways this can be done. One way was through entrainment, where you can create an inaudible signal that actually causes a modulated data on a carrier to show up in your brain, and you can hear things, music, words, sentences, whatever. This was demonstrated by a scientist on Jesse Ventura's Conspiracy Show, where he went to visit the HAARP facility in Alaska, and he got to see how this is done. So the idea that something can be put in your head through the electromagnetic spectrum and you think it's your own thought, guess what? Welcome to the slave war. It's not true. So the final battle for me, when I kind of started waking up as a sleeping agent in the simulator, was taking control of your thoughts. If you realize there's a battle going on there and you decide to participate in it, the battle's over because you just won.
You just woke up from the Matrix.
Yeah. So when you get these thoughts that are coming from the Matrix to either take you to your higher state or your destruction, now you're aware enough to know the difference between good and evil to choose. That's what that was all about in the Garden of Eden, which was in Samaria. By the way, the original beings couldn't procreate. They were taken to the Garden Eden, which is in Eridu, Enki's garden, and watched once they were genetically upgraded by Enki's son, Ningshita, who was a geneticist. He shows up in the Atrahasis account as well. Well, he turns out to be Thoth in Egypt. Okay, so all of Enki's kids usually end up as gods in Egypt. Enlil's peoples usually stayed up in the Levantine. Then they branched out from there and started heading east or west once they had some very, very devastating wars, one of which Ninurta, who was Apollo, Enlil's son, blew up the spaceport, caused a nuclear cloud to come across the Mesopotamia, and they all had to leave. So then they started migrating west, right? You start to see them in Crete, and then all of a sudden Cyprus, and they show up in Greece and North Africa, and then Rome, and then Europe, in England. Yeah, that's how they migrated. So now that you know that, and you look for their symbols, you can go, okay, well, what do we know? Let's start with Greece. That's where Western history always starts, right? They never talk about Samaria. Well, the myth of the Greek gods is given to you as just a myth. Well, now, if you look at the Anunnaki Council of 12 and the Greek pantheon, there's a lot of overlap. They were the same beings.
Please visit our website stores where you can purchase the always popular Starfire Gold alchemical elixirs, colloidal silver, as well as our books in English and Spanish, digital and paperback, and audiobooks too. Gravity Body Academy courses and events can also be accessed in the online store. Thank you for your support.
I waited a long time to get this poster. It just shows you the history that we missed out on or not told. And I've been a big fan of Gerald Clark's for the last couple years. I think he's an awesome guy and keep up the great work.